Maestros.
In today's episode, we decided we're going to jump right into the deep end of the pool and discuss a very challenging topic: racism in America, the arts, and how we can make a difference.
And we would like for you to join in the conversation. On both Facebook and YouTube, you can chat with us. You can ask questions or leave comments, and we will do our best to answer those during this time. But before we start, Joe, I'm curious, how do you take your coffee?
My coffee, I take it iced. I don't like hot things, and I put lots of sugar in it and lots of extra whole milk, so it's like an adult chocolate milk. So how do you take your coffee?
I take my coffee like I take myself, black and hot.
Oh, see, I thought something, I was scared about that answer, now I know why. Well, Jamal and I have had a number of conversations over the past week about race and equality in America, and we wanted to include all of you in the discussion. So we are here to learn, to listen, and to understand. We come with empathy, compassion, and love, and our hope is that through this conversation, it promotes even more conversations, and that through compassion and a greater understanding, we move on toward real change and lasting change. So Jamal, tell us your personal story about growing up as a musician and how you perceived racism in your early years.
That's a good question. I grew up in the city of Chicago, which, just like New York and major other cities, are a great place of classical music. When my mom was pregnant with me, this is how she tells the story. She just had a dream of me performing in major halls across the country and the world. And so when I was 4 years old, she put me at the Sherwood Conservatory. And at the Sherwood Conservatory, at 4 years old, you take these general music classes, and they teach you about percussion and piano and stringed instruments. And they teach you enough music theory for a 4-year-old to comprehend. But when you did that program for a year, you sort of graduated, and the conservatory had an open house. And you got to go to all the different departments. And at that time, there was strings, percussion, and piano. And I remember going to the piano department, and they were doing a little master class, and just watching what were white people playing piano, but in my mind it was just people playing piano. And I just was completely enthralled with the piano. And so I said to my mom, I want to play the piano. And she said, no, there's no way I'm buying a piano. We have no place in the house for a piano. So she took me to the violin department of the conservatory, and there was a teacher teaching a Saturday group class of young violin students. And her name was Lucinda Ali, African-American woman. And the majority of that class were African-American students. And my mom was very intentional about wanting me to experience classical music from as much of an African-American perspective as possible. So after a few years of being there, Lucinda decided to start her own school in Hyde Park, called the Hyde Park Suzuki Institute. And if you are in Chicago seeing this and you're looking for a place to send your student to learn violin, cello, viola, piano, send them to Hyde Park Suzuki Institute. But she started this music school, and majority African-American students, many Caucasian students, some Asian students, but it was just a melting pot of music, and of races playing and learning classical music. But it was not until I started doing competitions that I saw that this was not what the world of classical music actually looked like. And I was in high school, middle school and high school when I started doing competitions. And I just remember, one of the judges coming up to me asking me to go fetch them some coffee as if I was not one of the students participating. I was just so shocked by the fact that everyone at this competition, except for me and one other student, was either white or Asian, and mostly white students. So teachers were, and adjudicators were surprised at my level of playing, of my level of musical knowledge, as if it wasn't right for me to have this, or it's an anomaly for an African American person to be a good musician. And so I noticed right then and there that there was some sort of a divide and a prejudice in classical music. So that's sort of my story of really seeing, having grown up in a situation where I thought classical music looked like everything else. And to a certain degree, classical music does look like almost everything else in America, kind of whitewashed. And there was no learning of important African American musicians and composers in my formal education, and I think that is a problem. So, what was your experience growing up in classical music?
Well, mine was interesting in that I grew up in a small rural town in Iowa. It was 2,500 people in the town. We were proud of our one working stoplight. My graduating class was 32. It was a big year.
Wow.
But it was a nice rural community, but it was the most non-diverse place you could have grown up. There was no Jewish people, no Asian, no anything at all, just white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So it was very kind of an anomaly to grow up in, just because there was nobody that looked different. Until one year, a black family of 4 moved in this town. I feel bad for them. But they moved in, and I got to know Deji Coker. Deji was a few years younger than I was, and he played saxophone. We both played saxophone in jazz band. He actually went on to still plays jazz. But I got to kind of see a little bit what he was dealing with, and it was quite a different experience because our community didn't have a lot of culture. We had a band, we had a choir that was pretty good, we had a jazz band, but there wasn't a viola or a cello for like 20 counties.
Wow.
And the first time I heard a symphony orchestra, I drove down to Ames, Iowa to hear the Cleveland Orchestra, and it was like an unbelievable experience in my life. And I always tell people the first time I saw ballet, I conducted it. So, I was very void of culture, and we grew up in this really strange thing, and I think the community I lived in, I think because we didn't have people of different colors and races, it was the blacks, the Hispanics, the Mexicans, the blah, blah, blah. And I think people painted whole parts of our society with a black brush because they didn't have interactions. And I think it was, for me, it opened up my world when I went to college and got out of that little rural town and started being involved in the arts. And then you see that you have all of these people from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different cultures, and it just opened a whole world to me. But by the same token, I have to always remember that I grew up in this really isolated, non-diverse kind of community. And so I think as you get older, you're still seeing places you go, places that you say, wow, that's not who I want to be or what I want to be, but it's part of how you grew up. So I think certainly our growing up makes a difference in how we sort of expand and do that. So we thought we'd kind of hit you with a couple questions. This is a tough one, 2-part question. So what does equality mean to you, and what areas of inequality worry you the most?
It is a difficult question because as a musician, I understand that music is sort of a dog-eat-dog world. It's a competitive world. And so you always want to have the best product you possibly can. But both in our world and in music, that there truly is an even playing field for all people. And that we would throw out our preconceived notions about a specific race, about what they can and can't do, and that we would see people for their character. I would like to see equality within our legal system, looking at the insanity of minority incarceration in our country. It's absurd. The fact that 2 different ways of taking a drug gets you more time in prison than another. Watching African Americans not get jobs just because of what their name is. There's a whole mess of inequality in our country that people don't see. And this whole issue with police officers and the legal system in our country is the African American still seems to be fighting just to be able to live, just to be able to keep their life. Yes, we know that there are criminals and that people do bad things, but looking at the George Floyd case, it's sickening. It's sickening to watch cops standing there while one of their own has their knee on a man's neck and is killing him. I would like to see all people treated equally in our country. And so that's probably not the greatest answer or the most, educated answer, but from what I've seen in my own life and of what I have experienced, equality to me would be walking in my neighborhood and not having 2 white people in their cars following me to make sure that I'm not breaking into someone's house or stealing something. Equality to me would be being able to be on my back porch and not overhearing someone coming to buy the house next door that they don't want to live in a house because there's an N-word next door. To me, that's equality, not having to fear for my life anytime that I get pulled over by a police officer. That's what equality for me means.
I just wonder, I know a lot of people I've talked to, black people, they all have that same story, and I think too many times for white people we go, oh, well, they've got all this equality now, and I think we have blind spots. So I'm kind of thinking, that I think as white people we have blind spots that maybe we don't notice, but I wonder what are the blind spots that you notice in white people that we might not see?
I would say understanding that though you think we have had freedoms for so many years, it's simply not true. We look after slavery and the fact that it took 2 years to enforce that in southern countries. One thing that people might not know is Manhattan would not even allow slave owners to bring their slaves to Midtown Manhattan.
Wow.
But just that fact that for over 400 years, we have been fighting for equality in this country. And to some people, I would think to the white person, that they don't see that. They see that because a piece of legislation was signed or passed, everything's better. And it's just not the truth. We think of the civil rights movement, how much legislation was passed because legislation that was passed was not enforced in southern countries. So, the blind spots of the Confederate flag, that's a huge blind spot for many white people in our country. They see it as, preserving history. And when you're driving down 75 and you see an American flag next to a Confederate flag flying just as high, we aren't remembering history, we are glorifying history. to a black person seeing a Confederate flag, that's an issue for us. We have a right to be angry, because while we want to say it or not, the Civil War was fought mainly because of slavery. I think people try and find some other way to talk about the Civil War, but it was fought because of slavery. And so to think of the Ku Klux Klan coming to people's homes and burning crosses, carrying the Confederate flag, painting the Confederate flag on their cars, those are huge blind spots that white people don't tend to see, because they see it just as preserving history. But what they are saying to a black person through that symbol is, we wish you were still segregated from us. We wish you were still in slavery. Symbols are a huge, huge proponent of thought. Especially for me, I love symbolism. That's one of the things I love about church, is the symbolism of the cross. So I think those are some physical symptoms of racism, but blind spots in our country, and that white people might have. I guess I would ask the same question of you. What sort of blind spots, and I think you can kind of talk better on that than I probably can. What sort of blind spots do you see that white people in America have?
I think there's a lot of them. I think the biggest one you hit was, it's amazing you talk about the Confederate flag, and here it is 2020, and NASCAR's finally banned that. It just feels like we're so late. But some of the things I think about is kind of going back, and maybe it's not a blind spot as much as something that I think we don't admit or believe. And when we think about, if there's 2 or 3 black people at a congregating on a corner, what is the white person thinking? And they're thinking not good things generally. The assumption is something's bad about them. Maybe they're gonna do something terrible, and we don't. I think as white people, we should. It's not an open book. Unfortunately, we look at oftentimes a group of 3 or 4 black people, and it's a gang. It's a violent something. They're up to something. We don't look at them and say, well, look, there's 4 people standing there in the corner. I think that's a big thing, because you're looking at a group of people you don't even know, but you've already layered this whole just a sense of background that isn't even there. And I think that's a true blind spot. And I think oftentimes, I think when we were talking about the Black Lives Matter, then there's all people, well, all lives matter. Well, of course they do, but we're not talking about that right now. I think that to me is one of those things you go, well, the point of this is we're really trying to create equality, and saying things like, well, all lives should matter, changes the conversation to me. It changes it from equality for all to say, well, let's talk about the inequality that's here. And that what I kind of wonder is just, we hear Black Lives Matter a lot, but what does Black Lives Matter mean to you? When you hear Black Lives Matter, what does it mean to you?
We automatically go to the organization Black Lives Matter, and I'm very vocal about my Christian faith. My Christian faith shapes a lot of my worldview, and so there are some things about the Black Lives Matter organization that I don't fully support based on Christian belief. But the ideology, that line, Black Lives Matter, is really a cry for help, in my opinion. It is a cry to the world that we still in 2020 have not lived in the legal system, in the hearts of people. We are not living all lives matter. And that's why we are still crying, Black Lives Matter. Listen to us. We are experiencing still in this country injustice. Yes, we can go to whatever church we want. Yes, we can go to whatever school we want. Lord willing, they let us into certain private schools. But I say the same thing to my Christian brothers and sisters, to Mormons, to anyone. When we look at even religion in America, we need to be saying Black Lives Matter. I think people really forget how much of major religions in our country taught that slavery was okay, taught that segregation was okay, taught that Jesus was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white man. There's so much whitewashing racism even in our theology. One of the greatest fathers of the American church is Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards is theologically very good, has preached great things, but the man owned slaves. He used the Bible to say that slavery was okay. And so we can't just idly sit by and just keep going as if we don't want to see the past. And I think that's something we do, is we glorify the past, but we actually have to look at the totality of all things, all subjects. We have to look at education. Consider the fact that in most history classes in America, you didn't really learn about the integrity of the civil rights movement. They just wanted to talk about Martin Luther King. And generally there was always a conversation about Martin Luther King good, Malcolm X bad. But no one ever looked at Malcolm X's later life and the things that he said. No one looked at the totality of the civil rights movement and taught it without bias. And so there's so much bias within our theology, there's so much bias within our public education. And to me, Black Lives Matter really is getting at the heart of, let's expose all of the racist history, put it out there on the table, talk about it, and find ways that the Black voice is truly heard in America. So that to me is what Black Lives Matter means for me. And I dare not speak for the entire Black race. I think that's also something that white people need to understand in these conversations, is that there are progressive, there are conservative African Americans, and that these conversations about Black Lives Matter mean something different to all African American people. And I think a lot of times white people tend to, especially progressive, and I'm a progressive, Democrat. Sorry, I shouldn't talk about politics, sorry.
And we got religion in, so this is a good conversation.
Exactly, we got it all in. But I don't want a white person to come with just their specific agenda to this conversation, whether it be progressive or conservative. We need to be able to listen to people of all political backgrounds and see what because my experience as a Black man might be vastly different from another Black man or Black female's experience. And so it's important that everyone is at the table having these conversations about what does the Black Lives Matter movement mean.
And I think what you said, which is important, I think, is listening. I think we do too much talking and not enough listening. Mm-hmm. And this is really a conversation, so we want to involve your questions, comments too. So I'm going to introduce Ellen Vandola, who is Key Chorale's artistic, I always say artistic because she's very artsy, but administrative coordinator. And she's going to share a few of your questions with all of us in a second as she's working on how does that microphone work.
To know, what would you say to a white person who's angered by some of the violent protesting we're seeing?
That's a very good question. I am also angered at some of the violent protesting that we are seeing. I don't ever believe that violence is the way to solve that issue. But we have to understand, with all of the pent-up anger that still lays in the black race in America, that we are bound to see some sort of violence. Because often when we look at the race riots during the Civil Rights Movement, when we look at the race riots in the 90s with Rodney King, it feels that sometimes we are not heard until there is violence. But I would say, continue with that anger against seeing that sort of climate of violent protesting, and you as a white person do your part of maintaining healthy relations with people who are black and listening to the experience. Come from a place of humility and understanding versus just anger because there's violence going on. I think the majority of African American people would say that violence is not the answer. Again, I can't answer for the whole race, but I firmly believe violence shouldn't be the answer, but sometimes after not being heard for so long, it happens.
I have another question. Someone would like you to speak a little bit about what you think of the response, All Lives Matter. I know you spoke about it a little bit before, but could you speak a little bit more about that?
You know, so much of the conversations that I have on that are with people I have relationships with. And I think that's integral to any, important to any conversation is building relationships. To say that all lives matters in response to Black Lives Matter, I would say is a white blind spot, is ignoring, as I talked about, the cries of injustice. Yes, all lives do matter, and that should be what we believe in our hearts, that should be what our actions display. But the problem is that for all of America's history, we have not seen that all lives matter. And so we cry out Black Lives Matter because we don't feel that our problems, our voices, our concerns are being responded to. So to respond All Lives Matters to someone who says Black Lives Matters, I think is you kind of presupposing, bringing your own notions of what you believe and not actually opening your ears to listen and to be teachable. I think we all need to live a life of being teachable.
It's a good response. We want to talk a little bit of, obviously, Jamal and I make our livings in the arts, and the arts are kind of who we are and what we are. But you know, the arts reflect our world and culture. But I wouldn't say that the arts necessarily are at the forefront of social change. In classical music, which we both adore and is our place of comfort, social change has been very slow. And that's always been my opinion, but I wanted to see if my opinion was just an opinion or if it was fact. And so I delved a little bit further. And here's just a few statistics just to give you an idea. The Berlin Philharmonic allowed women to play for the first time in 1982, a century after it was founded. The Vienna Philharmonic did not allow women to audition until 1997, not that long ago. Now there are about 40% of American orchestras are women, so they've made some progress. But when you look at African Americans in classical music, wow, the numbers are really small. In 2014, only 2% of orchestra members were black. And when you look at conductors, for all of the conductors in America, 4.3% were black. And now I know in the choral world, we're doing a better job. We have a little more diversity. We certainly have a lot of very talented, incredibly gifted black conductors all over the United States. So we're doing better, but we certainly have a long way to go. So I wonder, for Jamal, what are your thoughts about where our art form is in regard to equality and racism?
I would say that we are still very far off. When we look at, and this kind of goes back to something we said earlier, when we look at music education in America, both in the children's programs, in the high school programs, in the music major programs of college, I wonder how many of the students leave college with a knowledge of more than one black composer, which generally everybody knows who William Grant Still is, but leave college knowing more than European white composers. And so to me, the first place of true change needs to be done in the education, in the music education system, is teaching about black art, especially black music, teaching about some of the greatest African American classical composers that are out there. There needs to be change in the music education system. But I would say there needs to be intentional change in our organizations. When they were doing the community conversations, the city council was talking about the orchestra. One of the things that, as I was watching it, did not seem to come up with is how much art is in that neighborhood where they were wanting to build. And I remember as a young boy, being raised on the west side of Chicago, there wasn't a lot of classical art in that community. But the fact that I could go downtown Chicago, go to Symphony Hall, see all the art around me downtown Chicago, as a black boy, that made a huge impact. And so for minority students not to be able to come down to see and hear Sarasota Orchestra in a community enriched in the arts, we kind of neglected that conversation, that question, I think, when Sarasota Orchestra and the city were talking about those things. I think that there needs to be intentional change within the administration and arts leadership of the American Orchestra and choral programs. We are continuing to idealize European conductors. But as an African American, who do I have to idolize? Who am I seeing with prominent posts? And I don't want to say anything mean against Sarasota Orchestra. I love Sarasota Orchestra and love a lot of the people in it. But I've been here 3 years now, and I've not seen one black guest conductor at Sarasota Orchestra. And that, not that they think anyway, but intentionally to bring in an African American conductor to perform the great classics, that says something. That gives me hope of the possibility that the world of conducting is open to all. Because right now it doesn't seem that way. But I would say in response to that, of all arts organizations in Sarasota that are being intentional and not an artificial way, is Key Chorale. When we look at our student scholar program, we didn't just go off the street and find random minority people. We attracted people. We attracted these students with scholarships, with opportunities. We didn't just go to Visible Men's Academy one time and do a little whitewashing there. but we made relationships with Visible Men's Academy. And I can certainly admit that I have not done all I can to be a part of that program with my work schedule, but that's something that's been very convicting to me, because as important as it is for us as arts organizations to bring classical music into the minority and underprivileged communities, whether they be white, black, Hispanic, or whatever, it's important that African American children see successful black men and women in the arts on a regular basis, because they too can visualize that it is a possibility. It's another one of those, it's a symbolic thing for black people to see Barack Obama. I mean, regardless of whether you agreed with his policies or not, to see a black man walk into the Oval Office and get to sit behind that desk for 8 years. Think about my grandmother's generation, think about my mother's generation, who thought that day would never come. And it's amazing where our country is. It's amazing where the arts organizations in America have come. But we have so much further to go in the American classical music arts. And not just American classical music arts, but to think about major recording labels. How many black people own these recording labels or are sitting in prominent positions of authority in as presidents or as CEOs? That's something we really need to be intentional about.
I know with us, we've had this conversation before, that so much of it is about access. Can we give access to this type of music, to what we do, to anyone, regardless of race or social economic conditions? And I think, I know with our work with Visible Men Academy, what's so great is that, without our involvement, they wouldn't have any musical experience. Mm-hmm. There's 100 at-risk boys from, 100 of them from kindergarten to 5th grade, but it's not so important that they love classical music. It's important that they have that experience, because then maybe someday when they look at an orchestra or the chorus, they go, I could see my place there, instead of going, well, that's a place that's closed to me. And I know we talked about Kwame Ryan, who's a black Canadian conductor, and he said young blacks have a lack of exposure to black conductor role models, and it's a deficit that is passed on from generation to generation. So I think as arts leaders, I think we have to sort of do what we can to break that cycle, to find a way to make it available. I know when we first went to Visible Men Academy, I said, I want to have these boys hear classical singers of different ages and backgrounds. And so you saying, we had Madison Spahn who's very young, 20s, wonderful opera singer, Lorraine Murphy, who's a little bit older, and we just tried to show them, here's a whole different thing. And of course, any kid who hears an opera singer, what's the first thing they say? Oh my God, that was so loud, but awesome. And that's part of it. But just being in the room with these people, and then we kind of had each of you tell what your story was, and every one of them was different. But there again, it was like the goal was not to do a pandering moment at Visible Men Academy, pop in, do our little show, and leave. Mm-hmm. It was like, and we've been communicating with them throughout this, I guess it's been 3 years or so, about saying, how can we assist? How do we do this? And it's always a real open dialogue. And they said, well, this is what we need, this is what we don't need. But it's not us saying, this is what we think is important, and here you go. It's a matter of saying, what do you need, and how can we fit in? And I think the whole thing with that, and it's just access. We've got to make sure that their world is opened up by seeing, like me, I was not near a violin until I was 18, and that's a different kind of thing. But can we make sure that these students, these young, that's a generation we've got to really foster so that we can make a difference. I know we're preaching to the choir, aren't we?
I'd like, I was sort of a part of it, but one of the things that Chorale does so well is our collaborative work. And one of the great experiences this past season was collaborating with West Coast Black Theater Troupe. How was that for you, just the first time you guys sat at the table? As you know, I imagine that they might have had preconceived notions about your intentions, or you might have had preconceived notions about their preconceived notions about your intentions. What was that like the first time you sat down at the table with them to talk about this collaboration?
It was interesting. You know, I think I've always admired West Coast Black Theater and Nate Jacobs, especially because of they've really carved out a really important part of our community, and they have a large following. And it was funny. We had Lee Holden, who was a past president, kind of brought us together, and so here we are, the Key Chorale people and the West Coast Black Theater, and we're in their offices, and we're all in this big circle, and we're all kind of staring nervously into each other. And it was a long, uncomfortable pause, and I didn't want to be the one to fill it. And I don't know if Nate or someone said, "So, what do you want from us?" And I said, "We don't want anything." I said, "We're just here to have a dialogue, a conversation. I love what you do. I wonder if there's some way that we can do something together that would benefit both of us." And you know, we had just done Elijah, where you sang the title role in Elijah, and Julie Leach, their executive director, came to that and said, "Wow, this is such a great organization." And what happened was we had, when you look at the audience for West Coast Black Theater Troupe and the audience for Key Chorale, there's almost no crossover. Mm-hmm. So from a business standpoint, we said this makes a lot of sense, because let's bring these two audiences together so that they can kind of hear what we do and vice versa. And then the other part is, when I think of choral music, most of the choirs growing up, especially my first 10 years or so, very, very white choirs. But what do we all love to sing? We love gospels, we love spirituals. And it's just something about spiritual music, gospel music. It is so soulful. It is something that, it's not just music, it's part of your bloodstream. It's just something amazing. And I always thought to myself, I want to know that when I do these pieces that I love so dearly, that I'm doing them in an authentic way, that I'm not just taking someone's genre and using it because it always gets a standing ovation. And so I really wanted to find a way to not appropriate that music, but to know that I'm performing in a way that's stylistically in the right spirit. And I think about, we would never do a Bach Passion without knowing Bach and the culture of that time and what's performance practice. We wouldn't do a Beethoven Mass without knowing what the parameters were. How do you perform it? We would never do that. But so many times I think it's easy for a white conductor to say, "Okay, I gotta put my Moses Hogan spiritual at the end and a gospel number," but not know the performance practice. So that was what I thought to myself, the gift I can give my singers and myself is this music that we love so much. Let's learn from people that grew up with it, and let's be able to have a deeper sense of the meaning of what goes behind it. And it was interesting. We went from that conversation of, "What do you want from us?" to becoming truly a family in the process of doing that. And I thought we all grew, and I think what we saw is that, in the arts, we can foster a sense of love and compassion and empathy that I think we need all over. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, I think.
I think you hit on something very important. It's just the relational aspect, but also just learning. It is, and we see it in high school choirs, we see it in all the ACDA kind of stuff, where gospel music and spirituals almost become kitschy. They become show tunes, and we never really understand the context of why they were written, what messages they gave. Many people never realize, how much the spiritual was not always just a Christian thing, but often was a way of call and response between slaves. And so we have ignored just immersing ourselves in the culture and because when we immerse ourselves in any culture, we begin to learn about who they are as people. We begin to learn about the injustices that they have faced in their and their lives and in their culture. And so to some degree, I think if we were to do this concert, had this concert, with West Coast been on the other side of what's been going on, I just imagine how much more potent it would be for us. So yeah.
It's interesting. We wanted to get you involved in the conversation again. I'm going to reach out to Ellen with a few of your questions.
I have a question here. For both Joe and Jamal, can you speak to what white privilege means to you, and how does it show up for you in society and specifically in the artistic world?
I think for me, white privilege, I saw a video that I just adored because it gave me a lot of context, and what it described was white privilege is like a 200-meter race, and all of the white people left at the starting gate, and they're running like mad. They're running like mad. And after we get about 150 yards down, they say, okay, black people, go. And the only way we can make a change is that either we stop running or we somehow go back and grab them and bring them with us. And I think that to me is that white privilege. I think we have to understand how far behind we've put people, and we have to be, once we understand that it's happening and we say to ourselves, okay, white privilege is a thing, then we can change it. And I think in the arts, I've been thinking a lot the last 2 weeks, what can I do to make a difference? And we were talking about black composers. So I looked at a list of 10 composers, and I knew 3 of them, and one of them is Scott Joplin, which shouldn't count because that's so easy. But as a conductor, I have a whole list of composers that I know almost nothing about. And so I have to educate myself about that culture and about those pieces. And if I'm doing my job as an arts leader, I have to be curious enough to say, what is it that they're writing that will be work into our programming? When I think about, I haven't been thinking about race when it comes to hiring soloists. I don't really think about that. It's not that I'm trying to hire one group over another, but it's because I'm not thinking about it. And by doing that, that's a sense of, to me, that's kind of an arts, that's kind of a white privilege thing where, I have a lot of white friends that are really great vocalists, so that's who I hire when I need a show. Mm-hmm. So now I'm thinking, okay, I can be a lot more intentional about that. So it's kind of where I'm coming from. What about you?
I would sort of agree with that. I think white privilege is just understanding that there are more advantages simply because of your skin. There has been white privilege in our country for its entire history, really. And understanding that, no, we don't want to just, and I think that's sort of when we begin to appropriate, as if we are just saying, well, I need a black person, so I'm going to stick them in here. No, we want, especially as artists, we want the best of the best. We want to hire the best of the best. But we want to be more intentional about saying, you know what, well, I really would like to hire stellar African American to come and do this role that's not just Porgy and Bess. And I think that's often how we see some sort of overt racism in the arts, is when we hire the black person to come and conduct, the William Grant Steel Afro-American Symphony, or we hire them to come and conduct, Porgy and Bess, maybe something along those lines, or Wynton Marsalis Symphony or something like that. That's kind of when we just say, like, well, you're black, so you do this. And we'll celebrate you, versus saying, what would it look like for us to have not just an African American come conduct, the smaller Mozart concerti or things like that, but what does it look like to have an African American or, a minority person come and conduct La Mer or Shasti 5 or Scheherazade, these large works. And this goes back to something also for me is we have almost very few American conductors. And all of our major orchestras right now, we have pretty much all European. You look at Boston, you look at Chicago Symphony, you look at the New York Phil, you look at LA. We have no American conductors. And so when we continue to bring conductors from other countries to do these jobs, not only are we negating the extremely talented American conductors, but then we are not having any opportunity for African American or Asian American conductors to come on the scene. And so we have to look at this from both the point of view as we need to celebrate the American person, which I know that might seem racist to some, but I think we do need to do a better job of celebrating the American conductor and making way for minority Americans to have the ability to conduct and not just hiring them to do a genre of music of composers that look like them. You know, I would like the opportunity to go to a major orchestra and conduct major works, as well as, you know, the Afro-American Symphony, as well as Wynn Marsalis, as well as all of these different African-American composers. And I think that's important as well.
All right, do you have another question from our viewers?
I do. How much do you feel that the low numbers of black orchestra musicians is due to racism within orchestras, or are there simply fewer black musicians in general? And if so, how do we change that?
Well, you know, it is not hard for there to be a lot of African Americans in the choral world, because throughout our African American history and even going back to Africa, singing has been a part of us. You know, every march that happened during the Civil Rights Movement, there was singing. Singing and singing has been an important part to the African church experience and to the Harlem Renaissance, things of that nature. As I kind of said earlier, the way we change that is by education. I believe at a time the orchestra was inherently racist. And was not making, I mean, if they weren't making a place for women, they weren't making a place for black people to be a part of that circle. So I think the orchestra in America has a long the orchestra in the world has a long history of racism. But here in America, I did not play in a school orchestra until I was in middle school and high school and went to an all-white school. That was the first time I had the opportunity to play in a school orchestra. I was playing in youth orchestras and things of that nature, but to be part of my academic life in school, that didn't happen until I went to a predominantly white school. So what would it look like for Chicago Symphony to be going into the urban neighborhoods and setting up programs teaching students from a young age to play these instruments, to understand these instruments? What would it say for Sarasota Orchestra as an organization to be going into minority communities, not just in Sarasota, but in Bradenton, all over Manatee County, and starting initiatives and being involved in the education and offering their services for free? A lot of these schools cannot afford to have music programs. And so if we want to continue the legacy of classical music, then it's up to us to give of ourselves and to go into these communities and teach minority students about classical music, making sure that we are letting them see important African American conductors. I bet you no one under the age of 30 probably knows who James DePriest is. He's really the only African American conductor that I can think of that had a prominent position in classical music. He was the head of the orchestra department at Juilliard. He was associate conductor with the New York Phil. He had 20 years at, I think, Oregon.
Yeah.
So that's just one person. But I bet you no orchestra conductor in major conservatories have talked to their students about James DePriest at all. It's not even part of the education. So really, in order for these minority students to understand these things and to get experience with these things, we have to go and be a part of their community, perform in their community, be a part of their school systems, and not expect anything in return. So to me, that's really the only way that I think that these African American students can become very good musicians and learn about classical music is by us going into their school system and offering partnerships and relationships free of charge.
Yeah, I think one of the things that maybe people don't know is pretty much every major orchestra in the United States does all of their auditions behind a screen. And so you don't know if the person is male, female, black, white, Asian. You don't really know that. So all you're hearing is a playing. And that's a really good way of doing that because it's a way of leveling the playing field, literally the playing field, so that they can have a really good leg up on that. So what that means is that we've got, what Jamal is saying is we have to start with the youngest generation so they can find their way in this world, that we can open up doors and paths to say, look, you could be a viola player, you could be an oboe player, you could be a wonderful tenor, you could be a great alto, whatever it is. But I think it's our responsibility to really find a way to instill in all of these children that they can see a broader world. You know, all of a sudden when you bring classical music or choral music and they get experience that as a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old, all of a sudden their world went from 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional and they can see their way in it. So it's really important. Jamal and I were trying to decide how long this was going to be, and we decided that the conversation's too important to be brief, and so we're gonna wrap it up, and I hope that you've enjoyed the conversation today. We're going to end with the big thing, the how, the what. How can we make a difference? And so, unfortunately, I'm going to leave the hardest question to Jamal to help us through this, and that is, and this is a question that I think all of us have to ask ourselves, and I myself included, and that is, what can we do, what can you do, and how can we make a difference together?
Man, that's a question that needs another hour.
I think that's another hour.
I guess just in simple, what can we do together is form relationships. I'm a very big proponent about relationships, and hear the struggles of the African American people in this country. But it doesn't just end at conversation. There's got to be some action behind it. And as people, the biggest voice that we have is protest, peaceful protest. So stand front and center with your minority brothers and sisters in their fight for justice. But one of the most powerful things we have is vote. And in our upcoming election, it's important that we vote. Over the last 4 years, the amount of racist and bigoted rhetoric that has pervaded our country, the forefront of our media, stems from the leadership of our country. And so we need you to get out and vote. Make your voices heard. And I think that's the biggest way we can make a difference. What I don't want to have people do is any sort of tokenism. We tend, as either conservatives or progressives, we tend to just listen to our side, whatever fits our agenda the best. And we do not, I feel like we've gotten to the point where there is no bipartisan conversation among people. And that's important, is to shape our mindset from a bipartisan point of view. So stand with your African American brothers and sisters, your Hispanic brothers and sisters, your white brothers and sisters, in this cause, in this fight for justice and equality in our country. And I would say to my church community, do not stand idly by, hiding behind your pulpits and your pews. Get out and be on the front lines with the people who are fighting this fight. Because it seems so far removed from us to some degree, because we can just look at the TV, but we are all part of this fight. We are all part of making this country a better place. And so get out and vote. That really is my summation of what we can do, is to get out and vote.
I think you're so right. And to me, it's about relationship building that you talked about. There's relationships humanize each other, and I think they're so important. Along with that, if we lift one person up, we're not just lifting up that person, we're lifting up all of us. And I think that's where we need to play a role in change. Let's hope that sometime 20 years from now, we look back at this time in our history as saying, that's the day that we said we made real change. So that's what we're hoping for. We're all praying for that day, and maybe today is that day, and maybe it's the start of many days to come. So we thank you for joining us on Morning Coffee.
And Maestros.
And next time we're together, we're going to do a little lighter topic, because this was a little heavy, slightly, and we're going to be talking about, we're going to give you our top 10 must-listen to pieces, usually on a desert island, but now during a pandemic, because they have time.
They do.
You have time. So we're going to give you the list of the best things you should be listening to. Jamal will give me his top 5. I'll tell him why he's completely wrong. And we'll have a great time. So join us next time on Morning Coffee.
And Maestros. And hey, if you are in the mood to study music theory, make sure that you study fixed do.
Oh, I totally disagree. See, that's the problem. All right, that's another session, because you're wrong again on that.
Well, thank you guys so much for watching.
Thank you.